So today we're going to talk about HDL almost exclusively, and it's from my data. So I made a little presentation because HDL has been around for 100 years. Whenever they took the first lipid panel, which I believe was really about 120 years ago, when they started looking at these things. So there's plenty of HDL data. So there's fasting HDL data. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it in different contexts of other biomarkers, in other words, other data, so you get a sense of how important that is. And let me give you the spoiler alert right up front, and that is this, that as much as we talk about HDL, it's the thing that your doctor talks to you when you go to your annual visit. They go, well, you know, son or miss or sir or ma'am, your cholesterol is a little high and your HDL is kind of low. And you go, okay, what do I do about that? Well, got to get your HDL up. Break here at that point. That's kind of like the generic comment that nearly everybody gets at least once a year, and they've gotten it for as long as they've been an adult, for the most part, or had insurance that covered that kind of doctor's visit. Not very helpful. And that whole idea of cholesterol has been put to bed. Different topic. I've covered that in plenty of other videos. But HDL is not just about, hey, get it up, so to say. HDL is really, now that I've, have at least over 100 people, much more than that, on these particular biomarkers, fasting compared to all these other contexts, it really comes down to just this thing, in my view and from my experience. And you can always say, well, Dr. Goldkamp, you don't have thousands of people. I should have had thousands of people had I done this 20 years ago. That would have been cool. But I don't, and I just started being more aware of data. And this is my data. All this is going to be about our collective data and the patterns that come up, because pattern recognition is the highest form of clinical evaluation in terms of one's health. It's the highest form. You look at pattern variation, not if you're within range or not within range. But anyways, back to HDL. HDL is so simple. It is such a giveaway. You show me your fasting HDL, and I'll tell you what your diet's like. Spoiler alert for this. It really represents, are you eating any whole foods sources of animal protein? Why is that? Well, it's the thing you were told not to eat too much of in the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. Because, those animal fats, high saturated fats, well, all of that is responsible for giving you higher HDL. And you cannot get higher HDL, as your doctor told you to get, without eating whole food sources of animal protein. That's the end of it. We're going to go through this and you're going to see that, so I hope you'll believe me. So HDL and biomarker trends, meaning other contexts, age, weight, and insulin resistance. Those are the basic ones that everybody can relate to, but pretty interesting, really. Scatter plot analysis of HDL cholesterol and related biomarkers across age groups, weight categories, stratified, separated by, insulin resistance status. All patients, meaning undifferentiated, non-insulin resistant people, clients I should say, and insulin resistance. Let's get to it. All right, so we're looking at 3 groups. All patients, you're going to look at charts, 3 charts, all patients, 6 charts, non-insulin resistance, and I could have done 10 times more on each one, so you'll be thankful that I did 6 on non-insulin resistance and 5 on insulin resistance. All clients, combined IR and non-IR, that's how we're going to refer them to, across age and pounds overweight. When I say pounds overweight, I mean pounds over ideal body weight. So ideal body weight is kind of the same as BMR, if you will, but I'm not saying people need to weigh that. It's a reference to kind of the average, what an average person should weigh. So I think it's a good, and I've done videos on that too, and it's a reproducible formula to say, what does that mean? Basically, it's height and weight, a little bit of age, and a little bit of gender. HDL versus age, scatter plot. So this is actually one of the older scatter plots I did. And the reason I pulled this one out instead of one with all the other data is because the graph hasn't changed. I think this is at least 5 years old. Hasn't changed. So the green line is non-insulin resistant people and the red is insulin resistant. So what do we say? Those who live longer, those who are older, have higher levels of HDL across the board. And if they're non-insulin resistant, they have far higher HDL. Okay, pretty straightforward. Pretty simple data, don't you think? And yet it doesn't change. It's absolutely. So how you say this, those who live longer have higher levels. You also can interpret that, and I do, as a better place to be. Those who are younger, and you can say, well, it's just the people that you've seen, Dr. Goldkamp. Clearly that's the case. And they're not, maybe they're representative of the world, but every doctor could do this. age and HDL, they all have that. Think of all the data. They plot it up there and you're going to see the same graph. And it will be millions of people perhaps to prove this. So this is a foundational chart, meaning it hasn't changed ever for me, comparing insulin resistance and non-insulin resistance. What's interesting, it shows that the HDL rising steeply with age from 40 to age 15 to levels of 97 by age 67 to 80. The older you are, the higher it is. Insulin-resistant people show a much flatter line. The divergence widens after 40. 40 is pretty interesting because in the adult world, meaning after 21, when you become to 40, you tend to be a little more aware of taking care of your health, that you don't take it for granted. Therefore, you start thinking about exercise and diet. Maybe you're listening to your doctor, maybe not, but you're starting to take a little more responsibility. So there's a differentiation about that, which just represents common sense. All right, triglycerides and HDL, we've heard a lot about that. In fact, there's a triglycerides HDL ratio, which we're not going to go into. We've done that in past videos. I think it's more valuable here to look at triglycerides and HDL separately on the same graph by age. And so what do we see? As people get older, their HDL gets higher. You know that from what we just talked about. And the triglycerides drop. So the formula is basically, if you have more triglycerides than 1.5 times your HDL. So HDL, a 1-to-1 would be they're the same number, that's 1-to-1. A 1.5 times more triglycerides would be around here someplace. So basically anybody to the right of all, if you will, that sign all, is non-insulin resistance. And those who live older, look at that, their HDL is even greater than their triglycerides. This is all fasting, of course. That's how significant it is. So those who live longer have higher HDL. We said that. Those who live longer have higher HDL than their triglycerides. That's the new piece. Okay, triglycerides, HDL versus age. Now we break it down. Is this graph, we looked at, one size fits all. Now we're just pulling it apart a little bit. What we find is the solid lines are the non-insulin resistant people, and the dotted lines are the insulin resistant people. Well, the insulin resistant people actually never get to having greater HDL over, but those who live longer, who are insulin resistant, do have higher HDL and lower triglycerides. Non-insulin resistant people clearly have much higher HDL than triglycerides at a much earlier age. So you could say, there you go, they're significantly healthier. That's kind of by definition. So the splitting of IR status reveals starkly different patterns hidden in the combined data. That's exactly right. Insulin resistance patterns. Triglycerides start high and they decline slowly. The non-insulin resistant clients, triglycerides drop from 115 to 50. HDL rises robustly from 35 to 105. That's impressive. Imagine that. How many people do you know say, hey, my HDL is 105 or 110? Well, more and more the people that are in my camp of thinking, a whole food protein source, a moderate, you might say ketogenic diet, but definitely having adequate amount of protein. Doesn't have to be keto or non-keto. So there you go. The IR group never achieves a favorable HDL dominant lipid profile. This is just another kind of, when you see bendy lines, these are polynomial, so they follow the data even more closely. So this is basically HDL, trigs, and through an iron. So what do we see? All right, blue. HDL, we just said HDL goes up as they get older. We also said that triglycerides, the green and the green, right? Here's the green and the green, they go down. We already covered that. What's interesting is your iron drops down too for those who live longer. Full lipid panel versus age, IR versus non-IR. And so this is the panel that your doctor goes, sir, have you been eating too much meat? And you'd say, well, yeah, is that okay? Well, apparently it's great. So that's the truth of it. All right, so what we see is total cholesterol will go up. LDL goes up, total cholesterol goes up, and HDL goes up. Of course, we've talked about that. What comes down? The triglycerides. What comes down faster? The non-insulin resistant people. So it just sort of spells it out. This is what happens. As an aside, did you know that if somebody is complaining and telling you that your some medical person is telling you that you should be on statins, and obviously because your cholesterol is high, total or LDL, here's hoping they're going by LDL, at least in that reference. Well, if you have a high-fat diet, your cholesterol is going to come down, and so will your triglycerides to an extent. You go, well, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. We should have a high-fat diet. Hold that thought. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it has other consequences. Well, if you also have a high carb, think of the donut diet. If you have the donut diet, their cholesterol panel is all going to come down. You're going to have a very terrible HDL and you're going to have a very high triglyceride. So that's terrible, terrible. But relative to LDL cholesterol and total cholesterol, you won't have to be on a statin. Same with the high fat. Which would you choose? It's rhetorical. Brief interruption to do my own ad for the book. So in the last year, I've written 2 books, which is a half-truth. Why I say it's a half-truth? Because this one over here about precision protein-sparing modified fast is something I co-wrote with my wife. This one I did unlocking optimal metabolic health, data-driven approach. It's the key. The whole thing is about data-driven approach. Data-driven approach to thriving at any age. Sounds like quite a title. What ties these 2 together? Well, my part is about lab works and going very light on labs, which you know that I go deep on, generally speaking, in most presentations that I do. But these connect. I think people need to understand that labs are kind of like an archaeology, if you ask me. You get to find the truth of where we've been. When people, and so when we talk about protein-sparing modified fast, we're talking about, some people call it carnivore. I think it's a little more nuanced than that, but call it what you will. Why this, I'm justifying it in terms of lab work. I'm justifying it, and I show you how to do this. So it's the cut and dry of how this is, but it's really the justification historically, anthropologically, by the way, a lot of that research, but also my own labs, let's say 100 plus people that I've worked with, that I go, this is really interesting, and now I know why this is so valuable. It wasn't just a way to lose weight, and that's why most people do. Really, they're talking about losing fat, but the unlocking optimal metabolic health, that goes still pretty light on labs, but why you need to look. So this whole thing is about expanding the window of personal awareness, expanding that. So you go, I know a little more about labs, and you're going to know a lot more about yourself, but it's actionable information. So these 2 books, and then and by the way, here you can freeze frame this and find out what's in the books. And I do go and get into supplements and muscle growth and a lot of things are really interesting. Covered it on the whole last video, so I'm not going to go too much into it here. And here's the next one, and you can look in to see what's in this, or the previous video also covers that as well. But the coup de grace, my wife did a cookbook on how we eat, basically all the recipes we use, and there's plenty of them, of precision protein-sparing modified fast, precision PSMF. It's such, get all 3. And they go together as a set, if you'd like. So here's a saying, here's where statins come in. Anybody who has an LDL, total cholesterol over 200 should be on a statin. Anybody who has an LDL over 100, for the record, I'm at about 300 for total, and I think I'm 200 something, 190 for LDL. My HDL is nearly 110 at times, certainly over 100. What do we find here? Skull and crossbones, statins. It's just the reality. I just think they're overprescribed. I think they're almost useless, and I think they cause a lot of harm. All right, HDL versus pounds overweight. This is what I told you about before. So just because somebody is heavy doesn't mean they're necessarily fat. You know that. So you think of a bodybuilder, right? Bodybuilder's got all that muscle. They're heavy. They're heavier than the average person, of course, because they work out. They want to be hypertrophied. All right. Well, how do we differentiate? Well, first of all, we're just going to look at everybody. So heavy, doesn't matter how you got there. What do we find? The higher one's HDL, the lower their pounds over, the closer they are to ideal body weight. In fact, those who have, in my group, have 90 or more are actually underweight a little bit. What the heck? What the heck? Deep down, let's dive a little deeper. HDL and glucose, this is really pretty cool as a pattern. And there's no way you would know this if you didn't have a collective amount of data to look at. So just look at, here's everybody. Yes, so as they get heavier, we're not saying whether it's fat or it's muscle, as they get heavier, everybody, undifferentiated, well, their glucose goes up. And you go, well, isn't that sort of obvious? We have obesity and, it's all about, yeah, parts. And their HDL goes down and we find that that's a bad thing. It's the opposite of what people who live longer have. All right, now let's break it down. The solid lines are non-insulin resistance. Look at the HDL and the glucose. They are like 2 tracks of a railroad station, 2 tracks of a train. They go together. Now just look at the dotted lines. They're just the opposite. It's like a novice skier that suddenly can't even do a snowplow. His skis go in opposite direction. This is very important. So this trend, we said trend is the highest, most helpful way of interpreting your labs. Not so much your in range or outer range. Most of these labs are within range, quote unquote, within range. There's no bad guys. But when you look at the pattern is phenomenal and very telling. And we haven't even gotten to anything very sophisticated, right? All these things are what? Are we spending $10 or $20 of labs? Glucose, iron, HDL, triglycerides, pound overweight, all patients. What does it look like? Putting all these things together, we find, all right, the more overweight they are, the lower their HDL. Or you could say the more on we're weighing what they should be, or even less, is what I just said, higher HDL. Are you getting the HDL vibe now? All right. And of course, their glucose goes in the opposite direction as they gain weight and triglycerides go. Triglycerides are just an extension of glucose. We talked about in previous videos. And iron is about flat or comes down a little bit. All right. Full lipid panel versus pounds overweight. Now separating insulin resistance from non-insulin resistant people. What do we find? Find kind of what we expected. Wait a minute. So we have solid lines or non-insulin resistant people. We're finding as they get heavier, a couple things. Yes, their HDL comes down a little bit, or it's correlated with lower HDL, not by a lot. When you look at the beige line or whatever calling that color, it's clearly far lower HDL for far higher pounds overweight for non-insulin resistant people. Triglycerides are higher. Kind of things that you knew. But we're saying, wait a minute, these people who are overweight, they have good cholesterol if you're coming from the standard allopathic perspective. Something's wrong with this. So heavy people don't need to be on statins. Obese people don't need to be on statins because they have good cholesterol. Yeah, but their HDL totally sucks. And their triglycerides are very high. So there's that has to be fixed. Glucose HDL ratio. This is interesting. And by the way, this is an actual thing. You can even look it up in Google or Chat GPT. You'll find that it's moderately useful. But it is an actual ratio. So glucose over HDL, where everything is about HDL, right, in this video. What we find, look at this, non-insulin resistant people, they basically have a flat line. So it's just, and it says it's just moderately higher glucose than HDL, but that stays the same. There's no relationship. When you see a flat line like this, there's no relationship between that and pounds overweight for non-insulin resistant people. But for insulin resistant people, meaning diabetics and everybody else that have all these other issues, it is soaringly high. That's almost 100% correlation. So that's a big difference. If you put them into one category, you're going to miss a deeper truth. So the ratio may be one of the most discriminating markers between insulin resistance and non-insulin resistant population. So it's the glucose and HDL. Okay, non-insulin resistance, triglycerides, HDL versus age. Non-IR patients, we saw that, right? They get higher HDL sooner in their life over triglycerides. And the non-insulin resistant people, the insulin resistant people, never happens. Triglycerides and glucose and HDL versus age. What do we say? No surprises here, but what we find is that the glucose and their HDL become, remember those two tracks, those railroad tracks? They become pretty much the same line. So for those who get older, who have pretty much, so that'd be the glucose HDL, almost a 1-to-1 ratio, they're very healthy. And what else happens when that happens? Triglycerides drop like a stone. Drop like a stone as they get older. Okay, glucose, iron, HDL, triglycerides versus age. Same thing, a slightly different, a little more dramatic picture. And what I've just said. Again, those two railroad tracks, glucose, HDL, go together. You can say, well, as they get heavier, they both come down. So the glucose comes down and the HDL comes down. Well, what can explain that? Well, basically that's muscle mass. So they have more muscle mass for poundage over their ideal body weight, whereas the non-insulin resistant people, it's not about muscle mass, that's about fat. It's about visceral adipose tissue, if you like that word. Okay, glucose, iron, HDL. Again, now look at this. Iron actually drops a lot for non-insulin resistant people. A lot of people have too much iron. You can say, well, wait a minute, didn't you just talk about eating whole food sources of protein and doesn't have a lot of iron? Well, it depends what you eat for sure. If you mix it up with organ meats and muscle meats, not just all muscle meats, you'll find that you'll get an appropriate amount of iron, but not too much. HDL, triglycerides, and iron versus age. So what you see here is that as people get older who are insulin resistant, think of a diabetic, their HDL goes up. They're healthier than the younger person who didn't have that high HDL. Their iron doesn't change that much, and their trigs come down. So it's a good direction. They got to work on it more. Insulin resistance. Full lipid panel versus age. Here we go. For insulin resistant people, as they get older, their cholesterol goes higher. So those who are insulin resistant that live longer have higher cholesterol. Didn't your doctor just say, no, you shouldn't have higher cholesterol. We need to put you on a statin. This data doesn't agree. You can say, well, Dr. Goldkamp, you don't have 1,000 people. No, I don't have 1,000 people, but guess what? Any doctor could show you the same thing. Any doctor. The pattern identification that is important here. You got the pattern? Again, now we have the same pattern. Now we're just comparing the solid lines versus the dotted lines. What do we see? Like we've always said, healthy people, non-insulin resistant people, their HDL goes up. Their triglycerides come down. All right. And their glucose, look at this. Their glucose goes up as they get older. It's all within range. We have my data from 70 to 90. Still fine. Glucose, iron, triglycerides. Look at that. 2-track glucose and iron also are together coming down. These are for insulin resistant people. HDL, trigs, iron, again and again. So we see glucose for insulin resistant people. Again, think of those who are on their way to becoming diabetic, but they're living long. They're heavier now. So we're not about age. They're heavier. So those who are non-insulin resistant or heavier, yeah, you can call them obese for sure. There's a greater representation of those who are insulin resistant that are obese. So we have lower HDL. We knew that. We have pretty much level iron. Doesn't change too much. We have higher glucose, of course, and we have higher triglycerides. Key comparisons and conclusions. Putting all the findings together, what do we get? Age-based comparison of the two groups, insulin resistant versus non-insulin resistant. They both have the same trend, but non-insulin resistant people get to have higher HDL earlier in age. Or in other words, if you want to be a healthy older person, longevity, age reversal, if you believe in that, or how about just aging well? Aging well, positive aging. You would need to have higher HDL. If you focus on your HDL, it's a theme here. Focus on your HDL. You're focused on your HDL. Everything is going to like step out of the way. I guarantee it. Your triglycerides will go down. And you can see the trend is the same, the dotted lines. But so for non-insulin resistant patients, achieves favorable HDL triglycerides by age 55. Okay, weight-based comparison. HDL declines versus glucose HDL ratio. What do we see? The lower the HDL, the greater their pounds overweight. The higher their HDL, the more ideal body weight they had, and even arguably thinner than a little bit lower. Interesting. All about HDL. All right, we broke it down. What do we see with glucose and HDL? No correlation with non-insulin resistant people, the glucose HDL ratio. But you look at the insulin resistant people, wow, that's 100%. That's solid. Or if you want to say R squared, high. All right, HDL is powerfully modulated by age and weight, but insulin resistance is the dominant factor. Insulin resistance is, we're talking about diet here, right? We're talking about diet. We're talking about if you calculate the appropriate amount of protein you need and you make that source of protein, whole food sources of animal protein, done and over with. Done and over with. Obviously, it's a step away from processed foods and the refined carbohydrates. But if you focus on that, what I just said first, you're not going to really have much of an appetite for that other stuff. I've seen it happen hundreds of times. That's the answer. Triglycerides, HDL crossover, talked about that. If you want more of this information, I suggest you buy my book on optimal metabolic health, a data-driven approach to achieving that at any age. Take care. So if this is something that you're interested in, that is a topic that I obviously go deeper in terms of labs, in terms of how to do it, in terms of why you would want to do it, various topics, as you've seen that I've done in the past, then please let me know below in a comment. Till then.